In 1850, the map of the world underwent a sudden, silent transformation. Entire regions labeled as Tartaria on centuries-old Dutch and French charts simply vanished, replaced by blank spaces or new, unfamiliar borders. This was not a slow evolution of geography, but a deliberate erasure that occurred within the span of a single generation. Look at the neoclassical buildings in cities like Washington, St. Petersburg, or Paris. Official records claim these structures were built by 19th-century settlers using horse-drawn carts and manual labor. Yet, these massive stone edifices feature advanced ventilation systems, precise astronomical alignments, and masonry techniques that require industrial-scale machinery. The timeline of construction provided in textbooks often spans only a few months. In the desert landscape of Phoenix, Arizona, researchers have mapped an expansive, ancient network of irrigation canals stretching over 500 miles. These channels were engineered with such exact hydraulic precision that modern surveyors struggle to replicate them today. The official narrative attributes this feat to nomadic tribes lacking iron tools. Simultaneously, governments across Europe and the Americas launched massive administrative reforms. They mandated the systematic renaming of thousands of towns, rivers, and mountain ranges. This linguistic purge severed the oral traditions and local histories that connected populations to their ancestors. By replacing traditional names with artificial, state-sanctioned titles, authorities effectively reset the cultural memory of entire continents. History is not just what we read in books, it is the physical infrastructure we inhabit every day. If the origins of our cities are fraudulent, what else have we been told to believe? Consider the standard university curriculum. It presents historical progress as a linear climb from primitive tools to modern steam power. Yet, the architectural evidence contradicts this. Look closely at the basements of neoclassical buildings in major global capitals. Many of these structures possess lower levels that are partially buried in the earth, featuring windows that sit at ground level or below. Architects call this architectural style a basement, but the geometry suggests a different reality. These buildings were not constructed from the ground up. They were cleared out from an earlier, deeper layer of existence. The proportions of the doors, the height of the ceilings, and the sheer scale of the decorative stonework were clearly designed for occupants far larger than the people who inhabited these cities in the 19th century. When local governments issued decrees to rename entire regions, they simultaneously initiated the systematic burial of the past. Historical archives were purged, and libraries were consolidated. Any records that did not align with the emerging colonial narrative were categorized as myths or folklore. This process was not limited to one nation. It was a synchronized global operation. By controlling the naming conventions of rivers and cities, the state gained absolute authority over the narrative of the landscape itself. If you change a name, you change the identity of the land. If you rewrite the map, you delete the history of the people who lived there before you arrived. The evidence remains under our feet, waiting for us to stop looking away. Digging into the foundation of any major administrative center from the mid-19th century reveals a recurring pattern of structural incongruity. You will find layers of brick and mortar that do not match the upper stories. These are not mere design choices or aesthetic flourishes. They are physical remnants of a civilization that functioned on a scale we struggle to comprehend. Examine the massive, arched doorways of older courthouses or state buildings. They are often scaled for individuals significantly taller than the average person of the Victorian era. When these structures were repurposed, the original entrances were often walled off or partially sunken into the rising street level. Engineers of that time faced a logistical nightmare in adapting these colossal shells to fit a new, smaller population. They installed smaller windows, inserted modern staircases, and partitioned vast halls into cramped office cubicles. The historical timeline claims these buildings were erected for specific governmental purposes, yet the internal layout tells a story of retrofitting. You cannot easily explain the presence of heavy-duty ventilation flues, advanced heating ducts, and complex pneumatic systems in structures supposedly built by pioneers using rudimentary methods. These buildings were already standing, already functioning, and already integrated into a global grid of energy and communication. The colonial administrators simply moved in, claimed the infrastructure as their own, and issued the decrees that erased the original architects from the ledgers. The narrative of progress is a thin veil, masking a much older, sophisticated civilization that was systematically scrubbed from our collective memory. This systematic erasure extended to the very tools of communication. By the mid-19th century, telegraph lines began spanning continents with suspicious speed. Official records credit this to a sudden burst of Victorian ingenuity and private investment. However, these massive networks often followed existing, perfectly straight paths that cut through dense forests and rugged mountain ranges. These routes were carved out long before the invention of the telegraph itself. It is as if the infrastructure for a global communication grid was already waiting to be activated. The engineers simply strung wires over pre-existing stone conduits and mountain passes. Look at the old maps from the 17th century. They depict a world connected by a sophisticated web of canals, forts, and star-shaped cities that transcend local borders. This global network implies a unified governance, or a shared technological standard that vanished before the Industrial Revolution supposedly began. When the new powers took control, they did not just occupy these cities. They rebranded the entire world to match a fragmented, colonial vision. They replaced the ancient, descriptive names of regions with those honoring generals, politicians, or kings who had no role in the original construction of these sites. By stripping away the indigenous identifiers, they effectively lobotomized the cultural record. People were forced to learn a new geography based on a manufactured timeline. If you cannot name the land correctly, you cannot claim its true history. The physical structures remained silent witnesses to a civilization that was not conquered, but rather systematically erased from the official archives. Every transition of power during this period relied heavily on the destruction of original records. Archives in major cities were frequently targeted by fires or organized purges under the guise of modernization. When a city administrative office burned, the ledger containing the land titles and architectural specifications vanished with it. What replaced these records was a curated version of events where the new administration was credited with everything from the foundational layout to the complex municipal plumbing. This pattern is too consistent to be accidental. In city after city across 3 continents, the official history starts with a blank slate, ignoring the centuries of activity that clearly preceded the arrival of the colonial authorities. Consider the sheer volume of stone masonry required for these projects. Transporting and carving thousands of granite blocks for a single public building in the mid-1800s would have necessitated a level of industrial organization that simply did not exist according to the established economic data of that era. Yet, these structures stand as evidence of a society that possessed both the time and the technical capacity to execute monumental architecture on a global scale. We are asked to believe that these builders were pioneers living in temporary shelters, yet they produced cathedrals and administrative palaces that dwarf anything constructed by modern standards. The discrepancy is not in the architecture, but in the narrative. By severing the connection between the current inhabitants and the original creators, the state successfully solidified its claim over the entire physical landscape. This orchestrated campaign of historical amnesia becomes even more transparent when examining the rapid transition of administrative governance during the mid-19th century. New regimes did not merely inhabit the existing urban centers, they rebranded them. Street names were changed to reflect the values of the new power structure, while local landmarks were stripped of their original designations. This was not a random series of bureaucratic updates. It was a precise, global effort to detach a population from the physical reality of their surroundings. When you rename a bridge, a city, or a province, you invalidate the collective memory of everyone who once understood what those places actually signified. Consider the speed at which this process occurred. Within a few short decades, the vast majority of the population was forced to adopt a new vocabulary, effectively forgetting the names their ancestors had used for generations. This linguistic purge was essential for the legitimacy of the new colonial administrations. By controlling the language, they controlled the context of history. The old maps, which once clearly demarcated vast, interconnected regions under different administrative names, were gathered, suppressed, and replaced by state-sanctioned versions. These new documents presented a fragmented world, devoid of the complex, unified infrastructure that preceded it. This wasn't just a political shift, it was a comprehensive mental reset. By removing the labels that connected people to the actual history of their land, the authorities ensured that the true origins of these monumental cities remained buried beneath layers of forced, artificial nomenclature. These reclaimed spaces were then subjected to rigorous zoning laws that reinforced the state's control over space and time. By mandating who could occupy these grand halls and for what purpose, the new regimes turned ancient, multifunctional hubs into rigid, single-use administrative headquarters. This narrowing of function was a psychological tool. It taught the population that the environment was a commodity to be utilized under government license, rather than a legacy to be maintained. Consider the sheer audacity of the claims. Authorities asserted that they had brought order to a chaotic, primitive wilderness, while standing firmly inside structures that utilized advanced acoustics, subterranean pneumatic networks, and perfect meridian alignments. They did not just build a new government, they inherited a fully operational, global technological system and framed its existence as their own invention. The historical record was sanitized to remove any reference to the original builders, replacing them with a narrative of pioneering spirit and industrial breakthrough. This transition required the total suppression of local knowledge. Anyone who held records of the pre-colonial era was systematically delegitimized. When you look at the neoclassical facades of 19th century Europe or the Americas, you are not seeing the birth of modern architecture. You are witnessing the final stage of a hostile takeover. The architects of this revisionist history knew that if they controlled the labels on the map and the records in the archives, they would eventually own the reality of the future. The truth was not lost. It was simply buried behind a fresh coat of paint and a new name. Every official biography of the era reads like a script written by a single committee. Pioneers are depicted arriving at sites already teeming with massive infrastructure, yet their diaries describe building these structures from scratch. They claim to have laid vast stone foundations during winters that would have frozen wet mortar into useless dust. They supposedly erected monumental domes using only wooden scaffolding and horse-drawn pulleys, while neglecting to mention how they sourced thousands of tons of precision-cut granite. The logic collapses under the slightest scrutiny. When these settlers claimed the land, they did not just occupy buildings. They occupied the entire concept of history. They replaced local, descriptive names with a homogenized lexicon of political patronage. If a river was known by a name that hinted at its engineering purpose, it was renamed after a minor governor or a distant king. This was not a tribute to progress. It was an act of linguistic vandalism designed to ensure that no inhabitant could ever trace their roots back to the time before the Great Reset. The map was effectively sanitized, stripping away the connections between the people and the true, ancient function of their landscape. This erasure left a vacuum of knowledge that the new administration filled with a convenient, linear narrative of industrial evolution. It is a story designed to keep us looking at the surface, never questioning who laid the foundations or why the original blueprints were wiped from the public record. The evidence remains visible, provided you stop reading the map and start looking at the ground. The streets you walk today follow grids established by these same renamers. Look at a city map from the early 1800s and compare it with one from the mid-century. You will notice sudden, sharp changes in nomenclature that defy regional traditions. Before the mid-19th century, cartographers frequently labeled districts with names derived from local water features, geological markers, or ancient tribal designations that hinted at the area's original utility. After the administrative reforms, those names vanished. They were replaced by a repetitive, standardized list of classical figures, military heroes, and political dynasties. This was not a move toward modernization. It was a deliberate strategy to anchor the new regime's identity while drowning the previous culture in a sea of unfamiliar labels. By forcing the population to speak the language of the conqueror, the state successfully severed the link between the people and the land they occupied. An inhabitant no longer thought of their town as a legacy of a prior civilization but as a recent creation of the current administration. Even the concept of time was altered through the imposition of artificial calendars and centralized record-keeping. The historical narrative became a cage of dates and names that effectively blocked out any possibility of an earlier, more advanced era. Every time you accept the official origin story of your local town without verifying its physical layout, you reinforce the very lie designed to keep you disconnected. You are living in a renamed world, walking upon foundations you were taught to ignore, in a history edited for silence. Take the case of the great exhibitions held across the globe in the late 19th century. Millions of visitors marveled at sprawling neoclassical complexes filled with electric lighting, complex fountains, and ornate pavilions. History books label these as temporary structures, built of plaster and wood specifically for a few months of festivities. Yet, the archival photographs show solid stone columns, heavy iron framing, and immense foundations that were supposedly demolished the moment the fair ended. The scale of debris would have been insurmountable for the era. More likely, these sites were existing remnants of a global grid, briefly activated or showcased before being quietly repurposed or obscured by the encroaching modern city. Consider the standardization of time itself. Before the mid-19th century, regional time was based on local solar positions, reflecting a decentralized world where communities operated in harmony with their specific geography. The sudden push for universal, synchronized time zones was not merely a convenience for train schedules. It was a primary tool of administrative control. By forcing every corner of the planet to adhere to a single, state-regulated clock, the new powers ensured that no region could exist outside their narrative of progress. If you control the clock, you control the pace of history. You dictate when the past ends and the new era begins. These reforms were not about efficiency. They were about synchronization, ensuring that the legacy of a prior, sophisticated civilization remained trapped in the shadows of an artificial, linear timeline that we still inhabit today. This synchronization required the physical destruction of artifacts that proved the existence of the prior network. Consider the massive, star-shaped fortresses found in regions as diverse as Japan, North America, and Eastern Europe. These structures were built with an astronomical precision that modern military engineers find baffling, yet they were labeled as primitive coastal defenses in 19th century manuals. When the new regime solidified their power, many of these star forts were systematically dismantled, buried under earthworks, or converted into prisons and administrative centers. The original purpose of these geometrically complex sites was erased, replaced by stories of colonial skirmishes. The logic of this erasure is consistent across every continent. By destroying the physical nodes of the old world, the authorities ensured that no one could look at the landscape and deduce the true purpose of the architecture. If you destroy the star-shaped fortress, you destroy the evidence of a global, defensive grid. If you fill in the canals, you hide the evidence of a sophisticated hydraulic culture. If you change the names on the maps, you delete the memory of the civilization that designed the grid. This process was not a chaotic accident of history, but a surgical operation performed by a nascent bureaucracy. They knew that a population without a history is a population that can be molded into any shape the state desires. By stripping away the ancient identifiers, they effectively lobotomized the cultural record of humanity. We are living in a renamed world, walking upon foundations we were taught to ignore, in a history edited for silence. The evidence is not hidden in secret vaults. It sits in plain sight, embedded in the granite foundations of your local courthouse, and the straight lines of the canals running through your city. We are told these monuments were built by pioneers in covered wagons, yet the scale of the masonry and the hydraulic precision defy the capabilities of that era. When you examine the architectural gaps, the buried windows, and the illogical street layouts, the official timeline begins to fracture. It becomes clear that the 19th century was not an age of discovery, but an age of consolidation. The infrastructure was already here, functioning on a global scale, before the current administrative systems arrived to claim it. By standardizing time, renaming the landscape, and purging the archives, the state successfully severed our connection to the actual creators of this world. We are living in a manufactured reality, walking upon the ruins of a civilization that was not lost, but systematically scrubbed from the ledgers to ensure we never look back. The narrative of linear progress is a lens designed to focus your attention only on the surface, keeping you blind to the depth beneath your feet. Look at the maps of the past, then look at the ground beneath you. Ask yourself who truly built the world you inhabit. If you want to see more documentation on these anomalies and explore the evidence the history books ignored, hit the subscribe button and follow the investigation into the gaps of our official record. The past is still here, waiting to be rediscovered.